Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K-12 School Shooting Database, and I author the weekly School Shooting Data Analysis and Reports Substack. You can sign up for that for free. The guest today is somebody who has a different perspective than anybody else who's been on the show previously. Josh Novak is a trauma-informed school counselor and formerly a school teacher in the greater Chicago area. He also has very deep personal experience on this topic as he was a mental health first responder to the Highland Park 4th of July shooting that was in the suburbs just outside of Chicago. And he also works to really engage other educators on this topic as a volunteer for Teachers Unified to End Gun Violence. Josh, thanks so much for coming to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be here with you.
So Josh, you've got a background that's really interesting, teaching in a lot of different educational settings, and then also this niche specialty within counseling where it's being a trauma-informed counselor. I'm really interested to know is first kind of where did you grow up and what got you interested in being an educator in the first place?
Yeah, excellent. So I'm happy to dive right in. So this is a classic case of it was nurture and nature. My family is a family of educators. So by the time I was born, my mom was already in administration at a school. And so I kind of grew up in schools. I was pretty confident by the time eighth grade came around that I wanted to be a teacher. In fact, in my eighth grade yearbook, when they said, "What do you want to be when you are older?" you can pull my name up and it will say teacher next to Josh Novak, whatever that was, 30 some odd years ago. So
wait a second. So in eighth grade, everybody wants to be a professional athlete, a movie star, a musician, maybe an astronaut.
Yep.
What about teaching in eighth grade? Was it was your parents' influence or you just felt like the classroom was the right place for you?
I think it was a combination of both. I think it was, I had seen my parents and their experiences within education and how transformational it could be. And I also felt like at that moment in time, I was having a pretty great educational experience. I was blessed and fortunate enough to have some pretty incredible teachers up to that point. And so I really just, you nailed it on the head. If we pulled out that yearbook, there are baseball player and basketball player and ballet dancer and all the things. And then sure enough, you have me with teacher. And so I use that as my story because I have known this, or I've thought about this path for quite some time. And so what ended up happening, so I'm from New York, and I am from a suburb outside of New York City, about a half hour outside of New York City. And I would describe it as a traditional middle class, upper middle class, affluent suburb. And my ambition was to go to college to get an undergraduate degree in education and then come back to New York and teach at my high school where I graduated from. That was my plan. I loved that high school. I was in varsity sports. I was involved with clubs. I had great teachers. I thought, okay, I'm going to get my education degree and I'm going to come back here. And so what I did was I actually went to Indiana University, where they have a interesting program. It's social studies education. So a lot of times when you want to become a history teacher, which was my cup of tea, you either major in history or you major in education, and then you take some classes out of the other one. Whereas Indiana University had social studies education. And so that was the draw for me. And to make a very long story short, I absolutely loved my experience learning how to become a teacher. I had a phenomenal student teaching experience that was very different and diverse in that half of my student teaching experience was in Bloomington, Indiana, and half of my student teaching experience was in Istanbul, Turkey. And I will share with you that those experiences really sort of started the stage for me thinking about how important social emotional learning and how other factors besides the content plays a humongous role in our class lessons and with our student success.
And what type of school were you teaching at in Istanbul? And what would you say were the biggest differences between that versus your kind of traditional K through 12 public school in the US?
So I was at a school. It was a K through 8 building, and it was designed for individual or children of expats. So it was not a public education Turkish school. It was a private education Turkish school. Um, and so one of the biggest difference for me was I was not trained as a English as a second language teacher or even as an English teacher. I was trained as a history teacher. So transferring those skills to all of a sudden becoming more of like an English as a second language or an English teacher was a really interesting challenge. Um, for me personally. And then as far as the schools were set up, you there was a really regimented system. So for example, there was really strict rules and regulations in place. The students knew exactly what was expected of them at all times throughout the day, and the teachers and staff and parents knew what was expected of them at all times and all throughout the day. And there was certainly value in that, but there was also some challenges that arose through that. And that was my experience with this one particular school in, Istanbul, was that they had certain routines and procedures that were very rigidly adhered to. And I can't speak to the historical context of why that was, but I certainly stepped into it where there was protocols and procedures that were in place and meant to be followed.
So that must have been a pretty significant juxtaposition against working then in a school in Chicago. So what ended up as being a New York guy and being in Indiana? How did you end up in Chicago then?
Great question. So I went back to New York after I graduated, left Istanbul, went back to New York, started applying at my old high school. And crazy thing, they weren't looking for social studies teachers at that moment in time. It was a recession the country was going through. It just wasn't a very great time to be a social studies teacher. And I was actually unemployed. And I'm not embarrassed to admit that. It was a tough time for educators. And I was on Facebook one day and I got a Facebook message from one of my classmates at Indiana University. And he said, "Hey, I work at this alternative school on the west side of Chicago. It's like nothing you've ever experienced before, but we're looking for some staff members. Would you be willing to move across the country and come live in Chicago and work at this school?" And I am so fortunate and so thankful and so grateful for that message. And of course, I ended up following up and interviewing and getting a job at that school. Um, and I will just share with you, I had no idea what I was getting myself into, both in the sense of I had never been to Chicago. So I tell people the school that I was being hired for was right outside the United Center, like downtown on the west side. I was looking at apartments on Craigslist because this was a Craigslist time, and up by like Wrigley Field and all around Chicago. And it wasn't until I got here that I started to realize just geographically, I had a lot to learn. Um, and that was just the living in Chicago. That had nothing to do with the educational space. To transition into that a little bit, the first school that I was hired at, it was a charter school that was operated under the umbrella of Chicago Public Schools, but it was designed for students who had been removed from their traditional Chicago public schools for whatever reason. So many of our male students had been incarcerated or had been hospitalized for long periods of time. Many of our female students were out on parental leave or had other circumstances that were going on. And when I tell you that there was no amount of training that Indiana University could have possibly prepared me for in 4 years, that's an understatement of the century. Um, I had in my toolbox, I could write a great lesson plan. I knew about pedagogy. I knew about curriculum. I was excited about history curriculum, right? Like I was at this point where, all right, we're going to talk about the New Deal. We're going to talk about Reconstruction. We're going to talk about whatever. Let's really get into it. And then that's not how it worked out. I had students in front of me who couldn't have possibly cared less about the Reconstruction or about the Square Deal or the New Deal or whatever topic that I was trying to get through that day. And that was a really challenging thing for me to understand. And that really is the sort of the start of this path of, yes, I am a classroom teacher, but is there more that I can bring to these students?
And I think that that's a good point just to break for the audience for a moment, is that there are so many different variations in the ways that schools, both public and private, are set up in the country. That you have, your traditional neighborhood school that people might go to by zip code, but then you have charter schools, which charter schools can be lots of different things. There are charter STEM schools where it's for students that have a specific interest in engineering or math or a discipline. But there are also charter schools for the kids that don't fit into the regular academic environment, or there are charter schools that are just trying to upend the curriculum for all types of kids by doing a single class school day or maybe a different class orientation. And I mean, for you as a first year teacher, it's like, how does anybody even navigate or understand what these things mean?
Uh, Truly, I will be fully honest with you and say that I did not understand. I truly, at that moment in time, did not fully comprehend it. And sure enough, if we were to look back at some of my messaging at that time, I was telling people that I was working for Chicago Public Schools because in my mind, this school was operated through Chicago or by Chicago Public Schools, but it was under the umbrella of Chicago Public Schools. So yes, I just want to say thank you for pointing that out because this is a unique situation that does not occur all throughout the country.
And it's something that's really important in some of the modern discussions around school choice and school funding and just the broader kind of scope of the public education system. Is you need lots of different orientations of schools for different reasons, but they're not always one that people would necessarily elect into. Or if you had a decision to line item fund, if you had 50 schools in your district and you have one that's really well performing, and then you have a school for the most disadvantaged and in some cases unlikely to succeed students, then you might just zero out some of that funding if you're in a deficit. But having mandates and having federal backstops for funding means that there are all of these different opportunities for students. Because I mean, I don't want to make assumptions yet, but I'm going to guess there were some students in that school that actually really surprised you with their skills and abilities.
I, every student, to be clear, surprised me with their skills and abilities. And that is to your point, is that these students were not bad kids. They were not evil children. They had experiences in their life that led them to where they ended up. And truthfully, and we can get into this a little bit more, much of that was the community and the neighborhood with which they were growing up in. And it wasn't really a personal choice or a personal determination. So yes, every single student I had the pleasure of interacting with on that campus absolutely surprised me for the better.
Yeah, I heard a really powerful anecdote recently, which was based on some surveys of incarcerated teens and younger men, that about 90% of those people that are incarcerated, you could trace back the reason they're in jail or prison to one really bad decision that was made in a very short period of minutes, where something turned into a robbery, something turned into a shooting, something got out of hand, and that ends up putting you in jail or prison. but not people that are, maniacal lifetime criminals. And I think that's a really important piece in the education system, is that if we don't get people through education, especially teens that are involved in the juvenile justice system, they are going to become lifetime criminals because they don't have any opportunities. But they may be very bright people who just made one bad decision or in one bad circumstance. And so we've got to find ways to make sure that they are connected with a way to go to school, to graduate, and ultimately be involved in a much more pro-social situation. So then from being in that school, you transitioned into other education, but eventually kind of found your way into counseling. Can you talk through that part of your journey?
Yeah, so ultimately, the best way I can explain it is I was trying my best to be a classroom teacher. I was hired as a classroom teacher, and that was what I knew how to do. So I was trying my best to get through content and be the relationship first teacher that I always was learning to be, regardless of what the school looked like. This was certainly a different feel to the relationships than I was anticipating, but still, I wanted to focus on the relationship piece. And so, as I was going through teaching, I found time and time again that my students were not ready. They were not in a place psychologically where they were able to learn. And that is, again, not a judgment call. That is a product of their environment and of their situations. They had to overcome so many, and of course, this is a generalization, but my students had to overcome so many obstacles just to get to school. Um, for it, the best example I can give you is one of the schools that I worked at, not the first one outside of United Center, but the second school that I worked for was in North Lawndale. And right across the street from our school was a funeral home. That funeral home was the busiest funeral home I have ever seen in my entire life. The bus stop the nearest bus stop to get to our school was right in front of that funeral home. So every student coming to our campus that was using public transportation was getting off at that stop that almost always perennially daily had at least one funeral procession going. And so I share that because that's just one tiny example of the experiences that these students were bringing into the school building that were then putting them in situations where they weren't ready to learn. And so I started learning how to become a counselor because I realized that until I get these students, until I learn how to help people feel psychologically safe enough to be in a place to learn, I'm going to be spinning my wheels and I'm going to be talking not accurately to my students, right? I'm going to be giving them information and I'm going to be relating to them in a way that isn't the most appropriate way.
And it's amazing you bring that up and you live that, because episode 29 is gun violence exposure on walkable routes to or from school. And that is a study of the South Side of Chicago and the number of shootings that were happening in the hour before and after dismissal along the major pedestrian routes. And it is incredible because we put so much time and effort into keeping kids safe inside of the physical school building, but there is an unbelievable amount of gun violence that just in this one study of one neighborhood that the kids are exposed to. I mean, there's a map. I'll put the link to the episode in the show notes. There are multiple dots. It looks like a Pac-Man game around all of these schools, and those are just shootings on these walking routes at arrival and dismissal. And do you have any memories of like times when students had experienced something and they kind of brought those feelings into the classroom with them?
Countless times. So, the first thing I want to share with what you just said is the adoption of safe passage was occurring in Chicagoland when I was in the classroom. And so that's almost exactly what you're speaking to, was Chicago Public Schools actually hired employees to man the street routes. And they, safe, it was designed to be safe passage. And so that these people were armed with walkie-talkies and cell phones, and they were designed to make sure that students got to school safely. And I am a huge proponent of that program. Clearly, there is a need to protect our students outside of the building. However, what I was running into is students were still walking past and walking through crime scenes. So perhaps the addition, and I don't have the data to back it up, but perhaps the addition of safe passage made it a little bit safer for the students on the actual time where they were commuting. It doesn't change the fact that my students are still walking and riding on the bus past those little yellow evidence tags all over the street, or a row of detectives' cars, right? So even though they may not have been exposed to the sound and immediate fear of the shooting, it was inescapable in
Oh, I mean, that's
all ways.
one of the consistent pushbacks I've gotten around the school shooting database and recording any shooting on school property is that there are incidents at nighttime, which I record. It only comes out to about 8% of the incidents. So it's, very low. But just because somebody gets killed in the middle of the night on the campus doesn't mean that it doesn't impact all of the students the very next day. I mean, imagine if somebody got killed at your office in the middle of the night. Like, do you think anybody would talk about anything else? Not to mention that oftentimes if somebody's killed at 3 a.m, it's going to be students and staff who are arriving at the school who are the ones who find the body. And if some students and staff members find a body, who cares if the shooting happened 3 hours ago? They are still dealing with all of that. I think it's interesting that you mentioned, the safe passage program, because I'm a bit of a criminology nerd. But that came out of some research in the 1980s called routine activities theory. And the thought was that if you have a capable guardian in a place, that capable guardian will deter crime. And in some studies of that, it actually did, but only for property crime. So
Mm.
that's why if you have a department store or a jewelry store, having that uniformed guard who's there at the front will actually lower your rate of theft or shoplifting, because there's a lot of empirical evidence that a uniformed person will make somebody think twice about property crime, which is usually really calculated. There are no known effects of the presence of a capable guardian on deterring violent crime, because it's almost always something that happens in the spur of the moment, or something that is deeply premeditated to the point where somebody being there isn't going to change the outcome. If you were going to kill your ex-wife either way, just because you saw a police officer, that is not going to change your thoughts about this crime that you've been contemplating for weeks. So it's fascinating that the programs like that have emerged, and you still felt like the students were having pretty significant exposure to trauma and gun violence and crime, even with people there in the streets. So we really have to think about the way that resources are allocated and what programs they go into.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There was still plenty of, students were still showing up to the building, plenty dysregulated. So it was not as if the safe passage was this panacea to get our students into the building regulated, feeling psychologically safe. If that was the goal, that was not met.
And
And
what do you mean? Because now, kind of putting on your hat as a trauma informed counselor, what do you really mean by regulated and students arriving, regulated versus kind of in a window of tolerance, um, to be able to learn during the school day?
absolutely. So one of the tenets of pedagogy and counseling that I subscribe to is this concept. You just named it. It's called the window of tolerance. And it was developed by Dr. Dan Siegel. And essentially, what it explains is that all of us as human beings have a ideal flow state. So those of us who have work jobs, we know when we're in our best element, right? We're successful, we're cruising through our to-do list, things are being checked off. We can also extrapolate that into our personal lives, right? Sometimes you're in a really good state with your children, you're on the floor, you're playing, you're involved, you're more tolerant of perhaps poor behavior, right? All of those things. And that is what we would call being inside your window of tolerance. And that really is where we need students to be in order for education to be effective. Because if students or any of us are outside of that window of tolerance, as a result, our brain power and our ability to get to the front of our brain becomes significantly impaired. And so the two windows outside of the window of tolerance, that's kind of the north and south, if you will, is hyperarousal and hypoarousal. And we don't need to get into the science of all of that, but basically what it means is if you are hyperaroused, you're experiencing anxiety, agitation, difficulty concentrating. That's some of what we think of as like the fight or flight. Then we have hypoarousal, which is more like when we see students being numb, withdrawn, depressed, unmotivated. That's more associated with our freeze and our fawn responses in our trauma, our trauma responses. So that to me has ultimately guided so much of my education and my counseling practice, because for me, I have to recognize that students who are not in that window of tolerance are going to be inherently less likely to be resilient, less likely to be in growth mindset, less likely to be want to be challenged, just as you and I would. Right? If we had a really rough day and we were tired and we're hungry and we're cranky, and then all of a sudden my kid spills a giant glass of milk on the floor, whereas yesterday that milk might not upset me, all of a sudden today I'm a little bit outside of my window of tolerance. That is now causing frustration. And so that was a very high level overview of sort of where I come to this with our students, because we need our students to be within their window of tolerance. Otherwise, we are spinning our wheels.
Yeah, and taking it back to that example of, a crime that occurred overnight. So if you show up at your office in the morning and there's a body bag and police tape and shell casings scattered around the front of the building, your first couple hours at work, you're going to be panicked, you're going to be anxious. What happened? Your mind is not going to be on anything you need to do. And then as the day goes on and you find out that it was, your coworker that was killed during a robbery, well, now you're now you're in shock. And I mean, unfortunately, that's what plays out at many different campuses every school year, every school day. So then I guess it was some of your experiences in the classroom that led you to then decide you wanted to be a counselor and be a trauma informed counselor rather than teaching. So kind of how did that transition happen?
That happened because I recognized that the locus of control, the impact that I can make within the classroom, I felt was limited. And that is not to disparage the work of the incredible teachers that we have in this country. I myself, Josh Novick, did not have the capacity and the capability to continue to teach in that system. I will just name it. I personally could not find a way to make pedagogy and curriculum make sense in that environment. And so I personally had to pivot to an area like counseling, where I could then work on helping students get to a place where they are then ready to be engaged by a more effective teacher who does have that pedagogy and does have that curriculum. And so that really was the shift for me, was realizing that what I brought to the table and what I pride myself on is the relationship piece. And so I leaned more into the relationship and the healing piece than I did over the content and the education piece. And again, not to take anything away from those incredible teachers. We need all of these pieces. I just didn't have the capacity, both in my academia as well as in my self-care to be able to continue and sustain that. So that was the push that made me move more into counseling.
And I mean, that seems to align, with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that if somebody doesn't feel basic safety and security, and somebody isn't in that window of tolerance where, their basic needs on either end emotionally are being met, then, there's not a lot of purpose in the school day because they're not going to be able to get anything out of that. I think that that's one of the things that's been bothering me the most about hearing about defunding the federal Department of Education. Is one of the core tenets of Department of Education is funding the free and reduced school lunch and breakfast program. And for a lot of kids, millions of kids around the country, the only meals that they get are at school during the school day. And so how is a kid possibly going to learn if first they haven't been fed, they don't have the really basic needs around shelter and clean clothing and others. But then where you come in that feeling of safety, that feeling of your emotional needs being met, if that's not there, you're not going to get anything out of the school day. So then kind of what's it like then being that school counselor, and more specifically, what does it mean to be a trauma informed school counselor?
So, to be a school counselor in those settings, in the alternative school setting, was extremely challenging, especially because we're talking about what you were just mentioning with, if there was an unfortunate shooting outside of the building and we're showing up to it. Now, fortunately for me, that wasn't an experience that I ever had where I was actually coming into a active crime scene like that. However, as one of the only mental health providers in these schools, I was one of the people who would receive the phone call at 2, 4 a.m., letting us know that a student had either been injured or killed by a gun violence experience. And so, to your point of me being outside of my window of tolerance as, the behavioral health specialist, it started early. It started at 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. because that was sort of the procedure that Chicago Public Schools would go through. Is if a student was registered as a student and they were injured or killed, the first point of contact was either to me or my principal so that we could start developing those plans. And I will share with you that right there is one of the biggest reasons why I did not feel the position was sustainable for me personally. And I say that because of the incredible emotional wear and tear on clinicians, on counselors, on teachers that this takes. Right? We know all the research on what it's doing to our students. But what I really started to come into focus for me was what it was doing to me, and what that vicarious trauma was, how that was changing my life and my experiences. And so, one of the things I always share with counselors, especially counselors who want to become trauma informed counselors, where you are putting yourself in situations where you may be working with individuals who have been traumatized, one of the most important things you need to do is have controls in place to protect yourself from that vicarious trauma. It's cliche, but you need to put on your own oxygen mask before you help others, right? That is such a humongous part of being a trauma informed school counselor, because if we, the counselors, are not in our window of tolerance, then we are certainly not going to be able to get a student into their window of tolerance, right? Dysregulation is contagious. And so that was probably one of the biggest pieces for me of becoming a trauma informed school counselor, was beyond the knowledge of the systems and beyond the knowledge of our brain and our nervous system, really understanding the effects that it has on us, so that way we can be in the best position to help students where they are at.
And it's really tragic and disturbing that you talk about that toll that it puts on you and how it's not sustainable, because that's exactly the same sentiment that Dr. Beth Sandberg shared a couple episodes ago. She was the school resource officer division leader for a school district in Pennsylvania, and now the president of the Association of School Resource Officers there. And she talked about how she had no idea going into being a school resource officer that that is a 24/7 position for the entire duration of your career. Because to be a good school resource officer, you need to give your cell phone number to everyone. And crisis happens in the middle of the night. A kid's suicidal in the middle of the night. A kid's being abused in the middle of the night. For you, a kid gets killed in the middle of the night. And the public education system is strained. Everyone is stretched so thin. Teachers who barely make any money, have to spend their own money on the basics for their classrooms and for their students. And then somebody like you, who there are so few counselors already in schools proportionally compared to the number of students, then you're pushed to the absolute brim. And that's now three different guests, because this was also shared by Dr. Robin Kogan, school nurse in New Jersey. She's the former president of the National Association of School Nurses. She talked about how overtaxed school nurses are, where there might be a single nurse in a school of 2,000 students. People don't realize how much stress and strain this puts on some of the most essential providers, who might be the only mental health provider or clinician that a kid ever sees.
Yes, absolutely. And when we think and when we talk about things like threat assessments and risk assessments, so many of those things don't necessarily get documented in the way that we're saving lives, because it's preventative and it's proactive. But a an effective risk assessment or an effective threat assessment could take hours, could take days, could take lots of people having their hands in that investigation. And to your point, I think that that's something that's missed in our schools, right? Is if there is a comment made and schools are taking it seriously, which I do believe schools do take comments seriously, that is not a one-off conversation that you have for 30 seconds with a student, right? There is a procedure that you should be going through in order to assess the threat that student is presenting. And
Well, therein lies the problem, in that the concept of threat assessment came from the Secret Service and the Secret Service's method for investigating presidential assassins. And you have a federal agency with nearly an unlimited budget, tasked with protecting a small number of people, and any threat that's made that's directed towards those people, they have nearly unlimited resources. You could assign hundreds of agents to do 24/7 surveillance and background checks and interviews. But that model doesn't apply to a school, because you have the inverse problem in two directions. You don't have one person that you're protecting, you have 2,000 people that you're protecting at a school. And the conflict is not external, it's coming from the people within the school. So you're put in this impossible situation of doing a task that is thousands of times more complicated than the Secret Service's mission, with the tiniest fraction of 1% of the resources that they have.
and to couldn't agree more. And in most cases, we're talking about adolescents, right? So I think a piece of this that is missed when we're talking about high school and middle school is we are also talking about individuals biologically that don't have fully developed prefrontal cortexes. So as likely as you and I are to make a bad decision, you are exponentially more likely to make that bad decision when you are a teenager. And so that also plays a factor into all of this, is that we are not, when we are doing threat assessments and risk assessments, it is very different than the Secret Service, because oftentimes we're talking to a 14-year-old who may be having a 14-year-old experience. And I'm not taking anything away from that. It's real and it needs to be dealt with. But that is a different conversation than you are going to be having with a 30-year-old who's threatening political violence.
And by the same token, you're challenged even more, because with an adult who maybe is suffering from severe psychosis, and that's the reason that they have a set of delusions and beliefs that might lead them towards violence that's irrationally directed at a person or place, you can't diagnose children and teens with most mental illnesses within the DSM criteria it's not until, early 20s that you could even make a formal diagnosis that would lead to some kind of formal institutional or mental health requirement for someone. So I mean, it is such a complicated situation to deal with.
Yes, it is. It is such an incredibly complicated and nuanced situation. And it is for that reason that I am a firm believer of this idea of hardening our schools. And I say heartening, like our heart in our chest, over hardening our schools. And I say that because you are the data expert, not me, but I know I have been in buildings that have physical security out the wazoo that doesn't necessarily feel like a safe environment. And I have been in schools that focus more on the emotional security and the supports and resources that they have for students in place. And the difference in how those schools particularly feel, where, the resources are allocated differently. And so it's my perspective of the more we can infuse heart into and hope and resilience into our schools, the better off the outcomes will be. I mean, research shows that when a social worker or a counselor works with someone who is having suicidal thoughts, they are less likely to complete suicide, right? Like this is not rocket science. These are just things that we need to increase and be more proactive with. I think one of the biggest issues that we run into in K-12 schooling is we can be very reactive. And I think there are some things that we can do to be a little bit more proactive in our violence prevention initiatives.
And I think that this is really important coming from you, having so much experience within the greater Chicago area and schools on the south side of Chicago. Is a lot of people will say, oh, it's just a pipe dream to have a warm, cuddly, inviting school. You've got to know what it's really like. But you actually worked in, statistically, some of the highest violent crime zip codes in the entire country. And if your perception there is that still a fortified building makes you as a faculty member, which there's a growing body of evidence that a lot of physical security makes both students and staff members feel more unsafe. I did an informal, or not informal, but a non-IRB study of parents' perceptions of school safety, and the schools that had the most physical security, ballistic windows, ballistic doors, metal detectors, those parents rated their perception of the school as less safe than the parents did at the schools that didn't have that. So it's a really interesting kind of paradox here, where people say, oh, you don't get it in these really dangerous areas. It's got to be fortified because that's the only way it can be. But in reality, both in your perception and your experience, it's actually completely the opposite.
Uh, Absolutely. And the concerns are not um, individualized. So, for example, those of us that are in education that fear, when a lockdown drill comes out, or things like that, that doesn't change whether we're in an alternative school in North Lawndale or in the suburbs of Highland Park, right? When a school goes on to lockdown, that is a physiological response that our bodies go through, right? And to me, it doesn't matter outside of the building what's going on right then and there when you're having a lockdown. So, to your point, all of that physical security is only effective up until a certain point, because then when you are experiencing lockdown and you are experiencing issues, the challenge is getting the school back to a place of feeling safe and back to a place where students can come in and express themselves. And that's often one of the most challenging parts, regardless of whether you're in the city or in the suburbs, is shifting that narrative when something has been written like that.
So then when people really do experience the trauma and when the worst thing happens and the worst day happens, I'd like to hear about your experience with the Highland Park shooting on the 4th of July and being a mental health responder. And for anyone who doesn't remember what happened, that was an adolescent man with an AR-15 rifle where he got up onto the rooftop and was firing down into the crowd around noontime, I think, on the 4th of July parade in Highland Park, which is just kind of a quiet suburb outside of Chicago.
Yeah, so as we've just been talking about, I learned how to become a trauma-informed school counselor and how to work with individuals, who have been experiencing violence as a result of being in those alternative schools in North Lawndale. I was not anticipating my hometown. And this is an important piece of this because even me, as a trauma informed school counselor, I felt that there was some safety in my commute to North Lawndale, right? I was driving from Highland Park to the west side and the south side of the city. And so it felt as if I was a little bit removed from the actual geography of the violence. And then come July 4th, I'm literally getting my son ready to go to the parade when all of a sudden, the phones start exploding and the police car and the whole thing. And so for me personally, that really shattered that myth of geographical safety, right? Like it can touch gun violence can touch you wherever you are, whenever. And that to me was one of the biggest pieces of that. Um and sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Oh, go ahead. It's a really traumatic experience. Obviously, that it's not only were you a mental health responder there, but that's your own community.
Exactly. So what had happened was I got a call on the night of the 4th from one of the administrators at Highland Park High School. And he said to me, he said, listen, we have lots of great supports. We're Highland Park High School. We have counselors. We have social workers. We have all of the resources. However, we don't have anyone that's really trained in gun violence response. We are, on the north shore of Chicago. We are fortunate enough to not deal with a lot of gun violence as of that moment. And so they were looking for someone to be able to come in and help set up a resource center in response to the violence. And so what I did was along with some other individuals, we created a community response center, which has now become a very popular, sadly, a very popular playbook when dealing with mass shootings. And so what we did was we set up at Highland Park High School and we recruited volunteer therapists to come in and staff classrooms we were using as therapy rooms. And we invited the community in. And what we were then doing was pairing community members who were coming in seeking support with these volunteer therapists who were willing to donate their time, their energy, and their effort. And so that was one of the most awful, but also one of the most beautiful experiences of my life because I saw over 600 mental health therapists, psychologists, counselors, social workers drop everything to be able to provide support to Highland Park, to our community that was going through so much trauma. There was countless donations. There was an influx of materials to support the recovery effort. One anecdotal story I always share is there's a very large company, I'm not going to name, that's based in the North Shore of Chicago, and they donated, I believe it was 5,000 Squishmallows to the Highland Park recovery effort. Now, if you're not familiar with a Squishmallow, it's like a $25 stuffed animal. Um, they just gave that to us so that we could set up stations in the building so that kids who were coming in who obviously experienced this horrific event were able to get some comfort items and were able to get art supplies and squishmallows and food and all of this. And so for me, that obviously was amazing, and I am so fortunate to live in a community and be a part of a community that really understands the importance of mutual aid. And I also had the knowledge of this is not the support that occurs on the west side of Chicago. And this is not what it looks like on the south side of Chicago when we have larger scale violent incidents. And so I am incredibly proud and moved, and will always talk about the incredible way that Highland Park rallied and was able to create that family assistance center and help thousands of people. Full stop. Truly incredible and transformational. And such a different experience than a 30-minute drive to the south, in both response, in donations, in mindset, in how people respond to it, all of those things. And so that really was the next sort of evolution in my career, in that now I've seen how gun violence can look in the inner city, in our streets. And I've also been affected by how gun violence can look in our suburbs with these mass violence shootings. And so, yes, it looked different, but the essence is that people are traumatized and people need to heal. And we heal in community. And that doesn't really change whether we're in North Lawndale or Highland Park. And so some of those healing solutions are what I really have then dove into, and trying to figure out how we can improve resiliency in our individuals that we know have experienced trauma. And there's nothing we can do, nothing I can do at this moment in time to remove that traumatic experience.
My last question for you is based on that experience with Highland Park and setting up that really robust mental wellness center. There is, unfortunately, this spring, there are probably going to be 2 or 3 pre-planned deliberate school shootings that happen. Most likely they're going to be at a school in a very small community, most often somewhere in the South or Midwest, uh, one of those little communities where you say this could never happen here. And because people think it could never happen here, there probably is not a lot of planning that has gone into what if it happens here. What is your advice or playbook or template or resources for what any school in the country needs to do and be thinking about to be able to turn on that kind of mental health recovery center immediately? Because helping somebody that night after the school shooting rather than 3 days later might have a really profound effect on their reducing their trauma. So, there, to any of the school administrators or parents or people in communities all over the country, what can they do today to be ready in case that worst thing happens?
Phenomenal question. And I am really sad to say that there are a lot of playbooks that currently exist because of the frequency of which we have these mass shootings and school shootings in our country. So, for example, the National Mass Violence Center, NMVC, they have a litany of resources that actually help communities think through the process of setting up one of those community resource centers before the event would occur. And so, exactly as you were just saying, that would be my advice to, any counselor or any school administrator, is look at what the plans are and start developing the plans for your population and for your school, and actually put people's names in them, right? Actually assign contacts, because what we've learned and what data has shown is that when those experiences do happen, we know there are certain roles that certain people fill. And we need to be cognizant of those roles, and you need people to fill those different roles, right? Like, not everybody is a doer. Some people need to be doing some things on the back end, right? And so the more that you can create contingency plans before an event ever occurs, you are in a much better position to quickly respond. And then the second piece of that is, I think, as any school administration goes through a response to a school shooting, I think it really then lends itself to asking some questions about the possibility of that school shooting. So when you are doing your planning, you can sort of reverse map it and think of where are our gaps, where are our areas of concern that we should be addressing. Do we need to train people in threat assessment, right? Do we need to encourage the idea of having a trusted adult, someone that every student can come talk to, right? So it's twofold. It is, yes, it's creating that playbook and having it for your population, and also using that to backwards map any potential risk factors.
Well, this was really some powerful lessons that you shared today. Thank you so much for being so open with your own personal experience and really traumatic experience there in your community. Josh Novick is a trauma-informed school counselor, a former school teacher. His experience is primarily in the greater Chicago area, and he's also a volunteer for Teachers Unify to End Gun Violence. I'll make sure that his contact information and the organization's contact information is in the show notes if you want to see it. And Josh, thanks so much for joining the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was an incredible experience.